All right. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. I am Kelly Keegan. I am the VP of People at Built-in, and I'm so excited to be with you all today. For those of you who aren't familiar with Built-in, our vision is to connect the world through a shared passion for tech and the human need for purpose. We help our 1,100 customers, companies of all sizes, tell their brand story and capture the interest of in-demand tech talent, or the 1.7 million professionals who visit our site each month. And after being both a longtime user of the platform and a two-time customer, I was thrilled to join Built-in this past fall, and I am honored to be here with all of you today, facilitating this very important conversation. Before we begin, I have just a quick few notes on webinar housekeeping. If you have any questions, you can go ahead and add them in the Q&A feature, and I will do my very best to weave them into the conversation today. We're going to be sending you the recording of this webinar so that you can refer back to it, along with more content in the future about this topic. Finally, we hope that you'll be live tweeting and sharing important takeaways using the hashtag #RecruitRemote. All right, so let's jump right in. We have some of the most passionate leaders in talent acquisition and HR joining this webinar today. We've spent our entire careers studying and building best practices and being progressive and strategic in our approach. And I can say that none of us probably have ever imagined that the global workforce would go remote essentially overnight. But it has, and it's our job to adjust our talent strategies for a remote world. And in the wake of a crisis, I can honestly say that for me, the silver lining has been how talent acquisition and HR communities have banded together to support one another. Built-in's tagline comes to mind for me: United We Tech. So we're here today, united as a vibrant people community to share ideas, strategies, and even war stories with one another. That's the focus of our webinar. And so I'd like to go ahead and introduce our panelists now. All right, we have Phillip. Reese is the Director of Talent Acquisition at Chewy. Leading a team of 18 recruiters, Phil is responsible for building the tech recruitment strategy for Chewy.com. Peter Lawson is the VP of Talent Acquisition at Postmates. Pete has spent his career building and rebuilding talent acquisition strategies while creating a talent brand to attract the right people. As trends evolve, it's critical for us to focus on creating the best candidate experience. And that's what we want to talk about today. We're going to cover remote realities in 3 areas: candidate nurturing, employer branding, and onboarding. And so let's start with nurturing candidates. The candidate experience includes every interaction candidates have with your company. And it starts well before they've applied, through your career site, job boards, social media, events. It also includes touch points that you can't control, like friends gossiping and employer reviews. And so as tech leaders, it's our job to shape our reputation in such a way that we snag the attention of passive candidates. And once the best candidates have applied, we need to ensure they don't slip through the cracks. And this whole situation with COVID has made that even more complex. So Phil, I would love to start off with you and ask, in your mind, what has been the biggest change in nurturing candidates post-COVID?
There's been many, but I will say that the one thing we try to emphasize to the team is that despite all the changes, what we do at our core has not changed. So I think the way I approach something like this is the nurturing process shouldn't change as far as what we're trying to accomplish. But I think if you look at what the process used to be as far as candidates' interest in a brand name, compensation, flexibility, commute, all those things have suddenly evolved and become different with the introduction of COVID and the pandemic. And now it's more around stability, risk, market positioning. So the changes that we are seeing most as far as the recruiting approach are in the areas of really making sure to identify the why, listening to the candidate, understanding what it is that's really motivating them to look. Are they scared of a layoff? Were they a part of a layoff? Do they see that certain things within their role may not be where they are today 6 months from now? So they want to get ahead of it. So I think it's really listening and understanding, connecting that to the why, and being able to explain really how our role, our job, our company could be the right fit for them. And even extending it beyond that, of offering to lend guidance outside of our own organization and whatnot, given the crazy times and the things that we've seen as a result. But I think now's the time for reassurance. I think it's the time for consistent communication. There's changes by the day. So I think it's making sure to acknowledge to the candidates that all the things we're doing as far as the cycle of recruiting remain the same, but the why behind it is slightly changed, and the impact is so much larger, and it's so much bigger. It used to be a candidate market where they could choose wherever they wanted to because there was a supply demand. The curve has changed substantially. Now there's a lot of candidates on the market. So, it's really just being honest, being transparent, continuing to build that trust. So I don't think at its core what we do has changed necessarily. I think how often we do it and how we explain it to really understand it is critical in order to position them and us, frankly, for what happens next. I think the last thing I'll say is no one prepared for this, right? So it's unprecedented. It wasn't prepared for. So I think acknowledging that for what it is important as well, as you're not setting false expectations or providing false hope, and you're acknowledging in that nurturing process that there are unknowns, and that you're transparent about what those unknowns are and how that could impact. But it's definitely a unique market right now. So I think the communication being clear, transparent, and frequent is extremely critical in the success of that process.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that. And then, so on the flip side, Pete, I would love to toss this one over to you. COVID's affected companies in so many ways. And so for some, it's still business as usual, right? Like hiring is still continuing. Others, though, have instituted hiring freezes. And nurturing candidates in a hiring freeze is not easy. You can't mislead people, as Phil had shared, right? Like it's all about transparency. And so you still, though, want to keep people engaged if you're under a hiring freeze for when you're ready to turn that light back on. So what nurture advice can you give to people whose companies are in a freeze? And why is it important for them to really focus on continuing to nurture those candidates?
Yeah, thanks, Kelly. Yeah, I definitely agree with Phil as far as, approach. It's very similar, I think, as far as like the frequency and how we're reaching out. I mean, obviously, Postmates is in a bit of a different position than we're not in a hiring freeze. We're aggressively growing and hiring. So, the tone at which we're reaching out has definitely changed. I think it's, being more sincere and honest and transparent with, like, to what Phil said is, this is something that no one has planned. I think showing up in this moment and showing what your company is doing. So we're trying to do this with some of our nurturing campaigns, but I think this goes the same for anyone that's not hiring as well. Is what is your voice in this time as an organization in this moment? What are you saying to your audience of future candidates, future employees? That's going to make an impact now. So when you reach out, 1, 2, 3 months, hopefully, sooner than that down the road, or 6 months, they'll have something in their head that says, that's a brand I want to be connected with. That's something, that's a mission that I can connect with as a human. And so when the opportunity comes up, when you do, hit them up down the road, it'll come back, and it'll be a lasting, brand in the memory. So I think, the advice I'd have is I think a mistake that you could probably make, I guess, would be to say nothing. I think you should definitely still keep the nurture campaigns on. There's a really great opportunity, I think, to connect. Right now, people just want connection. I think, a lot of folks that are being affected by layoffs or furloughs are in a tough spot, and I think companies that are reaching out to say, hey, we acknowledge what you're going through. We understand that. And here's some of the things that we're doing as an organization. Even if it's a very minor thing to help either our front lines or what we're doing for our internal employees, or even sharing some of that. I know there's a lot of, relief funds that are getting set up internally for certain organizations, or, other benefits that are kind of getting reestablished through this pandemic. I think it's a good opportunity to put a microscope on that and kind of broadcast that out to the community. The way I think of it is, even if you're not hiring today, I would still think of it, as a recruiting organization of like building your fantasy team. You still can bench talent. You can still engage with them. You can still connect them with hiring managers to have virtual coffee chats, kind of involve them in your brand. So it's a really good opportunity to get people interested in your brand now and what you're doing for the time that you do, come back and reach out to them for an opportunity.
I love that, building your fantasy team. So transparency, the having greater empathy with candidates, I think, is something that's clearly coming across in both of your answers. I would love to know how do you coach your teams? How do you coach your recruiters to have those conversations? Especially, Phil, you touched on how rapidly things are changing. It's really kind of on a daily basis. And so how are you keeping your recruiting teams up to date with the latest? And then also your hiring managers, right? Like your recruiters, you have a bit greater control over that messaging, but how are you passing that accountability to hiring managers and ensuring that there's consistency between how they should be showing up and what they should be saying? For either person, whoever wants that one.
So I'll touch on some of the internal communications, but I want to make one point to what I mentioned earlier about the transparency, and I can't stress this enough. I think it's very important for candidates applying and candidates going through the interview process. Keep that data up to date. Like, this is a time where people aren't working, may have been laid off. Like, you don't want to inspire false hope. And if they don't get the job, they need to know why. And they need to know that information in a timely manner. The same way if they apply, like, don't allow a black hole to exist. If the job's open it, work on it. If it's not, don't. So that's the previous. To answer your current question, Chewy's been actually outstanding with internal communication. So daily, our chief HR officer provides updates on any changes, whether it's benefits changes to our employees, updates on the safety of our employees, updates on any changes to virtual workforce and what that means for our employees. So that was daily correspondences from the executive level. From a leadership level, our directors and above all meet every Friday as a committee and talk through basically those communications and then business impacts and other things that have any direct correlation to our hiring, our brand, the market, and really have an open forum to discuss that, which I think has actually been extremely beneficial. And then it's cascaded down to the appropriate teams. So it's our job as leaders to make sure that our teams are clear on what's changing. But as an organization, we do provide a high-level update every day, so everyone is in the know. It doesn't have to rely on getting information secondhand. So I think from that standpoint, it's been a huge strength of the organization, because then we can discuss from a hiring standpoint, do we need to accelerate? Do we need to pause? Do we need to reprioritize? And then that gives us a better way to address the market for candidates and how they fit into that need and how the market conditions could impact short, medium, and long-term their candidacy. So we have a clear idea of where we need to be spending our time, and they have a clear idea of how they fit into that vision. So for the moment, for now, we've done, I think, an exceptional job. We've been very impressed with our leadership guiding that process. And everyone seems to be on the same page, which is, I think, very critical for a time like now.
Great. Yeah. And Pete, tossing that over to you as well, adding in the layer of how are you communicating with candidates, you and your team, around how the company is responding to coronavirus? I know that we're seeing from our data that people are just way more curious around how companies are approaching the situation, in addition to all of the other things that they typically want to know when they're considering a new opportunity. How are you fostering that transparency and telling that story to them? And at what stage?
Yeah, I think, similar to Phil, we've done a tremendous job with internal communications as far as, where we're showing up. We're a consumer product. We're in the I think a lot of you know what we do, but we, we have contract workers as well. And so there's multiple streams of communications that we need to definitely make sure that we're broadcasting so everybody understands, what we're doing as an organization and how we're looking out for everybody that's on those front lines for us. And then, who we're representing in the hospitals and how we're delivering to them. And I think, so it's twofold. One, there's internal communications as far as, what we're doing as an organization for our employees. And then there's what we're doing for our community. And then there's what we're doing for our fleet members. And I think so that's three, I guess. So that's, those three streams of, where we're showing up during this pandemic. It's really important on how we're broadcasting that. And so we do it through, internally, we're having our biweekly town halls. We have, weekly, we have communication that goes out on what everybody is doing within every team and how we're making an impact there. Specifically within our tech, engineering team, we have daily stand-ups with our hiring committee. So we're constantly in check with, with what our strategy is around hiring specifically, and then, how we're communicating around, this pandemic and what we're doing, even as a product and how we're delivering. So internally, I think we do a really good job there. So that, that definitely gets leveraged to how we communicate to candidates as well. And then, as an organization, we have our Civic Labs team, which is essentially, showing up everywhere. Hopefully you guys are seeing some of that, but I think like we're trying to leverage a lot of the work that team is doing in local communities and urban neighborhoods and whatnot. One example is, we're feeding nurses on the front line through, some of our merchants, the connections and partners that we have there, donating food and delivering, free food to nurses that are on the front lines. So we're leveraging a lot of the work that team is already doing to communicate to candidates and help them understand, that we're a mission-driven organization, and this is how we're showing up in this moment. And I think it's really interesting as you get into like the tech space and you're talking to engineers, and you're kind of showing this through your brand to represent, this is what's important to us as an organization. So if it's important to you, you can come build this stuff with us. A lot of the things that we've connected on the Civics Labs side, and more specifically the Food Fight initiative, that all came out of kind of like grassroots internally. Someone had passion for it, and it just kind of developed a body of work in its own. And engineers dedicated their Saturdays to put this together. And so I think, communicating that out is hopefully going to attract the right type of people to this mission and be part of something special.
Great. Yeah, I mean, and I think in particular, going with engineers, a lot of companies are still hiring for these roles that we call like roles of the future, being engineers, data scientists, product, folks that will lead the way technologies like AI, blockchain, big data, just to name a few, move forward. They're still really in high demand, but they're more risk adverse because of the climate. And so Phil, I would love to know, if these folks who are more risk adverse won't consider a company unless that you can show that you're stable, and this is well before they've even applied, how are you managing to project an image of confidence, strength, and stability during this time?
Yeah, it's interesting. And Chewy is kind of at an interesting conversion point of what the COVID impacts are. It's a lot of different things coming together that actually in many ways accelerate our business model. But I think I'd take a step back, and before any of this occurred, I think one of the reasons I found Chewy so attractive myself, and one of the selling points, was that I used to describe it as a recession-proof business, something that gave us the opportunity to grow in good and bad times. It's, our CEO said this, and I'm paraphrasing in a talk recently about pets. The only other area you say someone is a pet parent, the same way you do as if you are a parent, right? You're still taking care of your pets in good and bad times, no matter what the economy says. So I used to describe it as such, but COVID kind of converges a couple other things, and we were deemed an essential business. So I think the first thing is to really say we still have a commitment to our customers that rely on us, and that's extremely important. And we're categorized as such by the government to keep operating. People rely on our service now more than ever, right? So that's one. Two is they want to make sure that in getting our service, we're also keeping the safety of others in mind. So I think those daily updates, the safety, the security is very key. And then I think the rest of it is how you brand it, right? So like we are still hiring, yes. Our earnings call just hit the impact of our growth from a financials and revenue standpoints. There's validation to how we would project the future earnings and future growth of the organization. And then to Pete's point, the donations and the multi-million dollars, I believe Chewy's now donated in the 4 million range to shelters and other areas of need to help drive the brand. So from that standpoint, I think it shows in many different ways the aspects in which Chewy is persevering through this. But I think the other side is, and I think it's an easy way for us to describe it. So I think for my example, there's a lot of things that others may not have. So I think the guidance I would give for those in the other side of things that haven't seen growth from this and seen the opposite, which I would say is the majority, I think it's really key on just defining the why. Like all companies still need employees. Like we're not implying that companies don't need to hire, right? So whether it's, a very specific niche role, whether it's a more operational role, I think candidates just want to understand how they fit in. Like why me? Is it a backfill or is it a new role? And if it's a new role, why is it a new role? And I heard you laid off. What does that mean that you're still hiring, right? So I think it's where being an expert in your brand is imperative, and tying that into the why for the candidate is even more critical. And it may be it's not the right fit today, it's a better fit tomorrow. And I think fostering that, nurturing it over time, as we discussed, is very critical. But you gotta know how this impacts you. You gotta know what the future at least is projected to be like. And you gotta be transparent. There is the unknown factor as well. But from our standpoint, it's branding, but we are very sympathetic to those not in our position. So it's not all about drip campaigns, about Chewy's hiring, we're growing, it's great. Because you have to be very understanding of what's going on around you and very empathetic, sympathetic to those that are impacted. We want to be that support net, that place where people can go to get hope and hopefully find a great opportunity. But we don't want to make it about us, right? It's much bigger than us. It's much bigger than everyone else. So I would say all those factors come into play of how we strategize and going about the process itself. But for us, it's just acceleration of e-commerce, people being inside, pets being a needed essential business, like all those things converge. So for us, it's a pretty easy selling point, but we want to make sure we look at it from all angles and keep in mind that while we're greatly positioned, others may not be, and we want to be sympathetic to that for sure.
I love when you're so simpatico with with guests on a panel that I have an impromptu question that you just happen to bring up that will lead me into the impromptu question around drip campaigns. So there is, I think, more thoughtfulness and also a little bit of hesitation in the way in which we communicate with candidates today than ever before. And so both of you have kind of mentioned it a bit of like, the traditional tactics of drip campaigns or promoting on social media that you're hiring. There's a bit more sensitivity now. So Pete, I would love to know how you all at Postmates are approaching this. Like what are the different avenues that you're looking at, and whether it's an email campaign or social media or just pure conversation, at each of those stages, what are the goals of the communication? And also, are you seeing any shift with who you're partnering with internally to be able to assess that? I imagine probably you've already partnered with marketing, but there's probably way more communication now than ever before. So would love to hear your perspective on all of that.
Yeah, for sure. I think, I think the velocity of our drip campaigns has increased, and there's a couple of reasons for that. One, I'm going to give a little plug here, but we recently rolled out Eightfold, which is an amazing tool for those of you that haven't checked it out. But we're in the middle of launching and rolling it out to the team, and then COVID hit, and so we've really accelerated the timeline of which that we were going to build a lot of the campaigns that we had in mind at the beginning of the year. And so anyway, so that's accelerated that. And I think, I think what's changed is the tone. I think what I said earlier is just like the tone at which we're approaching the market. I think, some of the most recent drip campaigns that we've been sending out are more explanatory. Hey, this is, again, we're in a bit of a different position. We're hiring. So we still need to lean in there a bit because we want to have, great people read our stuff and understand that we're hiring. So, so there's definitely a play there. But I think the undertone is really just like, helping the audience understand, again, like what we're doing in this moment where we're showing up. And so part of the material that we've been leveraging is some of the blog posts that we feature, nurses in. We recently had a town hall where we had, nurses on, like, it's very much part of our DNA here is just like understanding the impact we're making to the humans on the other end of the burrito, and then also, and then more importantly, like what we can do as an organization to show up in these times again. So with the platform we've built. So we want to take a lot of that material and make sure that our audience knows about it. I think more importantly, what's changed, what I've told my team too, is, we are, in a fortunate position of hiring. We are, there's a lot of these lists that are coming out every day. And, I have multiple meetings with my teams on a weekly basis where, that's a big topic. It's disheartening to see that, especially for the role that we're in. We're in talent acquisition. We're in putting great people in great spots. And so as you see, what's going on with the world, it's hard for us. So what I've been trying to lead my team with is, we still have like a superpower, we're recruiters, we connect people. So, to the example of the people that, so the recent campaign that we sent out, it's about over 10,000 people we sent it to that were recently affected by this pandemic. Either they were furloughed or they were laid off. And, the message was two-part. It was one, hey, we're hiring still. So if you're looking, we'd love to talk to you. Two, here's some of the great things that we're doing as an organization. And three, just, let us know where we can help you. So I think that's where I say, like, we have a superpower to my team is like, we've gotten over 65% response rate with that outreach. So it's been really powerful, but there's a lot of people we cannot help in regards to putting them in a job in Postmates at this moment. But we still want to be engaged with them, and that we want them to be engaged with our brand. But also, I think more importantly, we have, all the recruiters on my team and other leaders within my organizations have large networks that we can connect them to. So that's what I've tried to open up to more of the public of saying, hey, is there someone within our network or my network that I could help introduce you to? Because we know you're in a tough spot. And so I think that's kind of the undertone of our messaging in general from a drip campaign standpoint. Some other strategies we've been working on is, the send on behalf, which I think has been very, very powerful as far as, have it coming directly from our engineering leader. I think what's really important with any of this messaging is that you respond. I think where you can go really wrong is you send out 10,000 emails and you ghost 9,000 people and you get 1,000 people into your ATS and you just work with them. I think that is the opposite of what we're trying to accomplish here. We're trying to connect people in a time where people feel really disconnected. So so I think that's kind of the messaging around, like, the strategy there. And then then there's just I think a completely different tone as far as you go out to the market and start talking about, like, some of the content you're putting out into different social streams and whatnot. But from a pure drip campaign standpoint, that's really that's been our angle in our messaging.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's so important. The not ghosting any folks that you're sending information to and candidates coming through. I think, we've heard from our users that people are just really frustrated. I think there's, some companies who hadn't made a decision around what they're doing with their roles. And I've seen some folks that are still hiring in their job postings, even adding like this, we are still actively hiring for this, or even maybe like this is going to be a September hire, and just creating more transparency there. I want to touch to a question that came in from one of our guests, which is that a lot of companies are hiring at this time, like we all are, and I feel very fortunate for that. But what advice would you have for approach if your company is really heavily impacted by COVID, rather than, a thriving one? And how do you communicate that to candidates, and what do you communicate?
I think this is it's a great question. It's a tough spot. I think again, I think it's important to show up very authentic and transparent. I think it's, Phil and I are here, delivering some feedback of far as like what we're doing and whatnot. But as he had said earlier, like we haven't been through this. Like no one has the answers. I think it's comfortable to be uncomfortable at this point, of knowing that we don't know. There's things that we don't know as far as like what the new normal will be and all that kind of stuff. So I think it's important to, make sure your audience understands that and your candidates understand it. I think whatever you can do to leverage whatever internal communications are going around, as far as, what you're doing as an organization, if you're not shutting your doors, like what is your growth plan now? Like, what is your new company strategy? I'm sure a lot of those missions are getting reset with what the company thinks they can project to do in the next 2 years. And whatever bullets or points that you can pull out of that to be able to communicate externally, I would definitely plead for that internally with marketing or with internal comms or whoever with your executive team, to get what you need for a new pitch material, essentially to candidates. Because and when I say pitch, it's just more of a like clear understanding of like, let me just take a little lens, a little kind of look in the window as far as like what's going on there, and let me see if that's interesting to me. And I think it's an important time to show up a little bit vulnerable in this moment too, and that's okay. I tell that to my team all the time, is like, it's okay to show some vulnerability in this moment. And even from a company perspective of, hey, we don't know some of these things, but here's what we do know as an organization. Here's where we want to be a year from now. Here's the mission that we're on. And these are the things that we would love for you to be engaged with us on and be a part of when it's time for us to connect again and to hire again.
Yeah, I mean, I think I've always been a really big advocate for vulnerability, but I think especially during these times when everybody really is in isolation, it's a way to create human connection, and it's okay for you to admit that you don't know something. And I think, again, just being as transparent as possible and trying to give greater insight into the why. If your company is stopping hiring, or you've had to go through any sort of layoffs and you're still hiring certain roles, it's being transparent both to your employees and also to the candidates that you're speaking with. And Pete, I love that you were talking about the superpowers of your recruiters. I think recruiters have lots of superpowers. But Phil, I would love to know, thinking about those superpowers and shifting over from the candidate over into the recruiter, what do you think has been some of the biggest changes for the recruiter? And do you foresee any more shifts in that role?
Yeah, I will say from my observation, and I think feedback I've gotten, I think the recruiting role has become more real and people understand their purpose a little bit clearer. And I would say that for all different levels of recruiting. But if I assess my team, who's also phenomenal, they're all superpowers as well, I look at it as, and the way I describe it is like, this is a time where we have the chance to make the difference of their life that may change their life today or forever. And that's a pretty powerful moment. So for me, it's always tying back into why we do what we do and why what we do exists in an organization in a good and bad time. End of day, like, someone is taking a phone call with us to trust us with their life, their family's life, their children's life. Like, that is a huge commitment and a lot of pressure to do well within that. So in looking at just that process, I think it really makes TA kind of on the forefront of that voice between the internal and external customer. Going back to your last question, right? Like, we're hearing all the questions as recruiters, questions from people unsure, uncertain, lacking trust, not sure what to do. And they're looking for us for that assurance. So we take it internal and say like, hey, what do we do with this? And does it make sense? So I think, there are unknowns, but the transparency is key. I think from a recruiting standpoint, understanding the purpose and value of what we do and why each step of that process is so critical to do well, I hope creates great fundamentals that should have already existed, but should be reminded of in this time that are not lost moving forward. I think the other side of it is from a paradigm shift. You see these lists from companies. That's unheard of years ago, months ago, right? List of companies that you've been trying to get in touch with these people for years, 20 outreaches, no response. Now they're on a list with their email and phone number just out to the public, anyone. It's unbelievable. So I think if you look at kind of what this brings, who knows where it will go, but I think it likely will lend to more collaboration across companies for talent. And I think there's value to that. I think sharing, caring is sharing, sharing is caring, whatever the phrase may be. Like, I think there's really value. If someone's not a good fit for your organization, how can they be a good fit for someone else? At the end of the day, you already have all the info. If we can translate that to how it can become used for a bigger purpose than just our own or our own benefit, it's tremendous. And that's networking 101, but I don't think companies do it well. I think individuals do. And I think that may be a shift in the recruiting landscape that may be something that changes as a result. So I think it's too early to tell like overall how that will work, but I will say it gets you back to the basics and really makes every point of what you're trying to accomplish so critical. And to see the impact, like for me, I got into recruiting so I could change people's lives. Cliche, but if you can see the impact now of a large company, someone there 10 years getting laid off and seeing the fear in that conversation all the way to the satisfaction and relief and happiness of what happens next, it's huge. And it's a big, big moment that you share with them and build that trust relationship that hopefully transcends to other people and extends well beyond that. But like, to me, those are things that we're seeing now that I hope aren't lost when we return. And I hope it's not a temporary, we'll get through this, but then everything will go back to normal. I do want that for the world, but at the end of the day, I think the silver lining is there's a lot of good lessons to learn and good things that can come about because we're forced to do things differently. That could be a bigger value moving forward. So I'm actually, depending on the time this takes, curious to what that lends to long term. But for us, we learn every day. And I think it's just taking those learnings and applying them and seeing how it differs from what we did before, and then translating that to a measurement of value to the organization, to the market, and hopefully change the perception of recruiters being headhunters or just about making commissions and those things, and becoming back to the advisory that really provides a value and changes lives. And that's my hope, but we'll see over time where that goes.
I think that was just beautiful. I got chills as you were reminding recruiters and TA really of the purpose behind what you're doing. And I hope for anybody who's watching this, if you've forgotten that purpose, that this just gives you an opportunity to kind of pause and check in with yourself and remember that, especially as days could be unpredictable and the world could be a little bit crazy right now. So Phil, thank you so much for sharing that. I think the topic of, all of a sudden having this dramatic shift to these folks who you've been, trying to source and do outreach to 20 times over, and now you're seeing them on a list. I joke that I sound like a grandma with my team when I say, I remember the days when everyone just came inbound and you didn't have to source. And then all of a sudden, like, the world changed and it happened overnight. And so I think you're seeing a pretty big population of at least younger recruiters who are not used to that heavy inbound and not necessarily having to source as much. And so seeing there's a couple of different questions that just came up in the Q&A that I'm going to try to merge together. How are you creating an approach to ensure that folks who are applying aren't feeling like they're ghosted, right? And how are you weaving through, there's so many qualified, experienced, strong candidates that are coming in, but just because the inbound is so much higher than it has been in years, how are you managing that communication? And Pete, I'd love to pass this one over to you. Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah, I just wanted to just kind of comment on what Phil mentioned. I think it's super important. And that's something that I've been trying to share with my team as well. I think to my earlier comment of the drip campaigns we sent out, one thing I forgot to mention is we received so many, in the past, you do some of these drip campaigns and you email people and, we know what that can appear like sometimes to the folks reaching out, unsubscribe or one word answers back and that kind of thing. I think what's been a shift is like we're getting paragraphs of information back of like how this has affected people's lives personally and what it means for them to even hear from someone that's hiring. And so I took a lot of those those quotes, and in our last team meeting, we put them up there and kind of went back to the fact of like, this is why we're in this. This is what, same thing that Phil said, is like, that is the reason I chose this career path. I wanted to make an impact on people's life in a positive way. And I think that can get lost in this hyper growth and like go. You kind of just forget some of that sometimes. And these are the moments that you should definitely pause and remember that. So anyway, thanks for mentioning that, Phil. I think that's super important. I think to answer your question, Kelly, I think there's a couple things. I think so tools. I think there's a good, like you said, our top of funnel is increased. Let's see, pre and post COVID applications is up over 121% for us. So there's a ton coming in the top of the funnel right now. And we didn't go out and hire 10 more recruiters or anything. So we're dealing with more traffic with the same people. Couple different things that we had put in place prior to this that I think is helping with making sure that we're communicating properly to people is just SLAs, just around, at each stage in the process, how much time should go by before we communicate anything. Even if we have nothing to communicate, we should communicate that we have nothing to communicate. So, we put those in place just in general, just because it's good candidate experience. And that's something we drive the team to, and that's something that we hold accountability to the hiring managers for as well. And so, we have an amazing recruiting ops team that keeps that in check constantly to make sure that we know that we're nudging people or responding in the right way. So, I think from a just responsiveness standpoint, we're pretty good there. As far as sifting through people and making sure that we're actually having a close eye on every single resume and we're thoughtful of every person that's applying. It's a lot of work. I think I think tools have definitely helped us though. I think there's, again, the timing of when we're rolling out some new tools was kind of perfect by accident, but Eightfold, again, it's another tool that we've really leveraged for some of our high traffic roles, like our customer support roles, for example. Where we can essentially build what our ideal candidate is on the back end, and Eightfold will prioritize all of those people that match, that apply, so we can go through that top 20% pretty quickly, and then continue kind of down the rank of going through the rest of the folks, so we can get to what we think is the best qualified candidate quicker. Which is then increased, our speed to hire is increased like over 50% in the last 8 weeks alone. So, and I think a lot of that is also because we're going into a more virtual environment and we can go faster. But some of the efficiencies are definitely driven through the tool. And then another tool that we've recently leveraged, a lot of plugs here, sorry, but is Pymetrics. So that's something we just rolled out as well. And that has really sped up the very beginning of the interview process, more specifically for our sales and our customer support functions, where you can essentially still have a two-way communication, an interview, but we can do it at a much larger velocity. So we can do pre-recorded interviews and questions, and people on their iPhone can kind of answer back and forth. And I think that has really allowed for our hiring managers to dedicate a lot more time towards building their teams and less time on interviewing, where 50% of their time was interviewing because we were just scaling so rapidly. So I think some of those tools have really allowed for that. I think, again, in this time, I'm over-indexing with the team on, like, it's really important to make sure we're dispositioning people in the right way. Anybody who's spent any meaningful time with us should not get an email of like, sorry, but no. They should get a personal call. We should definitely be doing what we can to go the extra mile to make sure that this is like Phil said, this is a life-changing event for people. As far as getting a new job, new house, a baby, those are big moments in people's lives. In this time, it's just even more hyper-focused on the outcomes of either getting a job or not. And it's really important on how we deliver that. So over-communication at this point is what we're leaning into.
Yeah, and so to recap, and then also to offer my interpretation of all of that, I would say it's really key to, in this new normal, of to establish what at each touch point and every stage of like the funnel, what is the timeline associated with a response and an update? What does that response look like? An email versus a phone call? How much feedback are you expecting your recruiters to give to candidates? And so making sure that that is really buttoned up so that you have clear expectations across the team. Okay, so shifting from the recruiting piece into onboarding. And so some talent acquisition teams have a bit of control over the onboarding. Some it's more on the HR side, but I think at the end of the day, recruiters are still responsible for knowing what onboarding virtually is going to look like. And also the complexity, if you're onboarding a large class, there's the technology associated with that. So let's shift the conversation a bit to the onboarding piece of things. And so as any new employee is going to transition into a new role, especially in really uncertain new normal times, they're looking for that consistency and clear expectations in a new role. And so many companies are onboarding virtually for the very first time. What are some of the concerns that you're hearing from candidates, and how are your recruiters communicating to them what your onboarding looks like and what shifts have you made? And Phil, I'll start with you on this one.
Yeah, I think people panic, right? Like everything changed. So Chewy is a great example of, we were a on-site workforce. We didn't have a remote policy. So we flipped what we did overnight. And it took a village. I think the one thing I want to emphasize at this call is, like, I may be speaking on behalf of Chewy, but I'm one of a million people that has been a part of getting us to where we are. So like, I want to make sure that it's known that not one person can do this. It relies on a phenomenal team and a lot of cross-functional efforts to get this done. Onboarding is a prime example of just that. So I think you have the difficulties of, it's onboarding and culture, right? Like someone's taking a job and starting sight unseen to a new company, new people. That's a big deal, right? So I think for a company like Chewy, where we're known as a consumer brand, and our brand is something that people, resonate with and get excited about, it's, how do we make sure that's not lost in this process? It's not about we need to hire quickly and this is the best we can do. It's nothing has to change. How we do it does change, but how do we make sure we provide a similar experience, knowing we're dealing with something that is very unknown? So, the questions are always like, will my computer show up on time? Will this login happen? I don't get to meet my manager. Who do I ask questions to? I don't know anyone. What does that mean? So the natural questions, right, that you'd have on site, but you can look to your right and left, and next thing you know, you got the answer. This is, you're looking at your walls and wondering, like, I don't have anyone's phone number. I don't know what to do. So for us, our HR team owns most of onboarding, but what I can say and how it's been addressed is, at first it was, come in the office, grab the equipment, it's voluntary remote. Now it's, we're gonna start everyone remote. So it's structured, you get a call before the week you start from HR, you get a call from recruiting. They have different things they communicate, but HR is basically saying, here's when you expect your equipment. If you don't have it, call the following number. Here's what to do when you get it. IT's number is the following. They're gonna walk you through setting it up before your first day. Your leader will be reaching out at the following time prior to start date, and we'll facilitate what we need to do that. And then it takes the village, right? Like, I've onboarded 6 resources on my team within TA, and it's a group effort because you got to give that cultural experience, knowing you can't take them out to lunch, or you don't have that introductory breakfast, or orientation's not the awkward 20 people. It's, virtual now, you still don't know. And it's even more difficult to get a pulse for that. So I think we do the best we can, right? Like, it was a full transformation. I think being transparent about, this is new for us. This isn't something we've historically done. There's probably going to be some issues. Provide us feedback. So like, for us, it's all about, what can you tell us to help us improve the process? And if you're not pleased with something, tell your leader, tell HR, tell recruiting. It's something we'll iterate on. Like what we do today and what we did last week, I'll probably laugh about 2 months from now if we're in the same scenario, because it will be so obvious of what we missed and then what we corrected. But we don't know what we don't know, right? So the goal is to make sure we're soliciting feedback and also talking to the appropriate parties internally to make sure we've thought of the candidate experience to the candidate requirements to the team integration, and making sure the proper touch points and comfort levels established. So, onboarding from a systems and equipment standpoint is pretty standardized. And there's good structure on that. And it's communicated well before the candidate starts. But then the onboarding itself to the team, to me, culture is a DNA. Like the team's got to want to be a part of it. That shouldn't change no matter where you sit, where you stand, what you do, who it is. So our expectation is that remains a focal point and something that there is a high degree of, dedication to, and our people are the number one priority. And that has to be seen by the candidates coming in. And the way I look at it is, if we do that right, the fact that they're remote and the fact that it's new shouldn't be something they're nervous about. It should be something they're excited to be a part of. And it changes the dynamic and it creates a really good experience that then is told to others, or then creates a retention that it's like, hey, I understand there was all these factors that were so difficult to get through, but you guys did the best you could. And I really appreciate what that meant for me at that given time. So I think every company's going to experience it differently, but there's not one company that can tell me they do this perfect, because we don't know what perfect is. So, it's learning every day, trying to apply what we've learned to change. But the key for us is making sure we communicate, but with expectations around what to expect and when, so there aren't surprises. And so they're not sitting there just waiting for something and not sure when that something will happen.
Yeah, I totally agree. And to just kind of summarize it, if you're brand new to onboarding anybody virtually, or really like just don't even know where to begin, I would say it is really setting clear expectations of what success looks like in those first 2 weeks, providing as much detail as possible so that your new hire is never like, what do I do in this moment? When you're in the office, it's easy to turn and be like, hey, what's now? It's a little bit more awkward when everybody is remote. So setting really, really clear expectations and as much of a schedule as possible for your first 2 weeks, even like, what do I do during downtime suggestions? And then thinking about it from a lens of like, what are the FAQs? Like, what is your coordinator getting a million questions about, and go and like proactively communicating that, and then getting into the next layer of like, what's important to our culture? How do we create those social connections with people? We're getting close. We have about 5 minutes left. So Pete, I'm going to pass this over to you into that next layer of culture. And we have a couple of questions that have come in specifically around diversity and inclusion. How is that being built into virtual onboarding and, even into any sort of the candidate communication process under the lens of D&I? What has been your approach?
Yeah. So I think one quick thing, I would just comment on the onboarding piece, just real quick, something that I think has worked well for us. And definitely like all the things Phil said plus one, because there is definitely a lot of unknown. I think the very big key here is definitely communication. And again, asking people a month from now, hey, what did we miss, to keep building and iterating on it. But I think one thing that's really been helpful for us, to Phil's comment of like, hey, you can't comment or reach out to the person next to you and say, hey, I have a dumb question, can I ask you? And not let anybody know this, is creating some of these more private community of Slack, groups. So like, for us, for example, if we have a new, 5 to 10 new people start on next Monday, they all get their own little community within Slack, and they can kind of ask each other the questions and share what they've learned in that smaller setting. So little things like that have been helpful. On the D&I piece, I think it's, I think that's a giant onion to peel back. I don't know, specifically if the questions around like, how are we making sure that we're approaching that in the right way from an interviewing standpoint, then that is, that kind of goes into the brand. I think, first, to me, it's understanding who you are and what makes up your company. I think that's the first step of identifying any of the gaps within, your diversity or any of the D&I standards you want to set for your organization. So I think to me, that's step one, is understanding who you are and where those deltas are. And then, the second step is, if this is from like a talent brand and attraction standpoint, is, going out, this can go back to the drip campaigns, this can go back to content marketing, but going to the audiences that you want to attract and or deflect to your brand, and making sure that you're showing up in those areas and they know who you are as a brand and what you're doing as an organization, more specifically during this time. And again, more of another Eightfold plug, but like, that is something that we've leveraged. So within Eightfold, you can specifically, source certain, certain diverse groups, either out in the market or, anybody that's applied to in the past. And I think that's one area we've really leaned in on, more specifically in engineering, you know, female leadership. So that's a group that we're, from a brand standpoint, we're really trying to attract more female leads here. And so, you know, we created some drip campaigns around that, created some content that goes out to the to LinkedIn and some other social sites that'll attract those people back to us. And then I think, you know, again, I think you should approach it authentically and not force it too much, as far as like, you know, how your tone and voice shows up in the market. And then internally, you know, as we're looking at how we diversify our panels, like currently we're in the process of blowing up some of our interview kits in certain groups, specifically knowing that there's some gaps there. You know, I think it's challenging for some certain growing organizations where, you know, if you start to think at the more specific skill sets within engineering or ML or and whatnot, where, you know, you want to have as much diversity on that panel as you can, but you maybe don't have the right capacity just from an expertise standpoint. That's challenging. And I think, you know, that's something that we're constantly looking at, and how we become a more and more diverse company to have a larger menu of options to be able to offer candidates when it comes to an interview experience. So I'm not sure if that answered the question, you know, more specifically, but that's, you know, some of the approach we've been taking. It has been that, and I think it's key to understand, obviously, where, you know, to kind of survey your employees too, and the people that you've hired in the last, you know, 180 days, and say, hey, how was your experience, and like, where did we miss, and you know, ask them some questions around diversity, ask them, you know, what their perception was, and to understand maybe some of the gaps that you're not seeing with some blinders on.
Yeah, great. Thanks for that. I cannot believe we're already at the hour. Obviously, could stay and talk to you guys for probably the rest of the day or the next couple days. But I just want to say thank you so much to both Pete and Phil for sharing your insights into your world and best practices. And I just wanted to highlight like 3 key takeaways, at least what I've gathered from this conversation. 1, transparency is really key. 2, just the acknowledgement, like, we're all in this together. We're going to be improving and iterating, and collecting feedback is really important, and just really leaning into the community of your employees, and also the people community that exists here. And 3rd, to just, you know, remember your purpose, especially during crazy, frustrating days, to take a step back to remember like why you're doing what you're doing, and that you have the opportunity to significantly change someone's life for the better just in one conversation. And so I know we didn't get a chance to talk about a lot of the questions that were submitted, but we will be following up with valuable resources around today's conversation. So look forward to ebooks around nurturing candidates. We'll also be sending a recruiter's playbook for turbulent times. And after this, we'll be sending a survey about the event for you to share feedback on today's session and topics you would like to explore at future webinars. So more to come here. And if you are interested in learning more about Built-in, feel free to reach out. Thank you so much for being here, Pete and Phil. Thank you for being here. And I hope everyone has a wonderful rest of the week.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.